So again, operational consulting, you could be at your client for a very long time. You know, you may be working on different projects or even working the same project. My first project was about 2 years, right? So same project, same client, 2 years.
And were you sort of allocated full-time to that one
Oh, yeah,
project?
yeah.
And you were at the client?
Yeah, so I was an analyst at that point, so you kind of go where you're told
Wherever
to
they
go.
go, yeah.
But yeah, I was there doing that work for 2 years, and there are outs. Like you can say I want to leave, but most engagements in the operational space are fairly long. When you're doing more strategy work, when you're doing some, like I did a cost analysis for a client once, and that was quick. That was a month and a half.
Yeah.
But that was more intense. So when you're actually doing the longer term engagement, so I was going back to that first engagement, I was on that project for 2 years. I was at the client for 4, right? So I went on to do some different work.
Were they like follow-on projects?
Yes and no. They're related, but not.
Okay.
They weren't like I went on to something else right afterwards. So when you're doing operational stuff, you're almost like a part of that company because you're partnering with them, and you almost feel like an employee at times. Just you don't get as great benefits.
In my experience, I've seen the average is probably 3 to 4 months for a project. The high end would be something like 8 months, unless when you become a manager, you might be working more really closely with a client, and they might want you to stick around longer. But at that point, you're starting to be building a set of clients that know you and trust you. But for what I expect is probably 3 to 4 months on average. If you're doing private equity group within Bain, it could be as short as 3 weeks because there's a narrow window of time that you have exclusive rights to the deal.
Right.
But if you're going to do the private equity group within Bain, you usually do it at a 6-month rotation where you say, I'm just going to do private equity cases for this period of time, and within that span of time, you'll do
Several.
anywhere from 6 to 10 cases probably.
Thank you.
Do you feel within the strategy group you have to be extremely quant focused, strong on quant?
I would maybe less so than, or definitely less so than what it sounds like the work that they do at Analysis Group.
Yeah.
I don't have a sense of how it compares to things, but there are cases that are going to be really quant heavy, and there are going to be cases that are very open-ended and qualitative, and so it could be anything under the sun. Really.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at Accenture, in their very small strategy practice,
Right.
there is that group that helps the CFO. We partner with the CFO to look at financial statements, balance sheets, things like that, and then look at cost-cutting measures and so financial improvement. But then if you're in the marketing strategy aspect of things, it's not a lot of numbers. You have to look at big data to be able to help out the firm decide, okay, this is where I think your marketing campaign should be, and this is how you should do it. But it's not as quant heavy. So I think, and I don't know how other firms are, but I think it all depends on almost like what industry you're aligning yourself into and what niche, like which group in that consulting firm you're part of. But I think the first couple of years, you're a generalist, right, at most firms, so you could be doing anything. And have you guys done case interviews yet, the MBA?
We've done prep for them,
Prep
but
for
no
them,
actual interviews yet.
Quant, like Nate said, quant is not super important to know for the job because you may or may not be doing it.
Yeah.
But I think it's super important for the case. At least in my experience. So I had this one interview. I'm not going to mention which firm it was. I did a math problem wrong. It was a complicated like I had to do multiplication, and they didn't give me a piece of paper, so I had to do it in my head, and I got it wrong. And that person, I saw a person cross an X on my paper because in the case interviews, you don't have to be strong in quant, but know your math. Like at least be able to ballpark, the mathematical figures. So if your math is weak, I would say brush up on it because it shows up more often than not in cases. Would you agree with that? Like,
yeah, there will most likely be math in any case you have.
Right.
But on the other end, I made an error, a mathematical error in at least half of the cases that I did.
Your people liked you. That's important too.
And it worked out.
Yeah.
Like Some of them I realized, some of them they pointed out to me, but because I had been talking through like what I was doing, it was able to come to light and just kept rolling and tried not to think about it. So if it happens, it happens, but yeah, try not to. It's probably a good idea.
Like Nate said, don't make any egregious errors. If you can't figure out
I
1
definitely made
plus
some
1,
egregious errors.
well, Nate's a likable guy, I'm not, right? So that helps a lot too. And in the case interviews too, so if you really are interested in consulting, case interviews are super important. I would say, focus, remember the math, like be able to get the simple mathematical problems right. Number 2 is you're still being interviewed, so have a conversation with your interviewer. Don't just sit there doing the math problems and thinking in your head. If you are thinking about something and you do want to take some time to think about it, tell the interviewer, like, can you just give me a couple of seconds? I'm thinking this in my head. And at least walk them through your thought process as well. It may or may not be right, but at least they can see how you're thinking through it. And they'll guide you, like Nate said. Sometimes if you're wrong, they'll guide you in the right direction. But do talk it through. Don't just sit there staring at your piece of paper blankly and not tell the interviewer what you're doing, right? Because number 1, you're not talking with them, which means that you're probably not going to be very good at talking with clients, right? And number 2, if you're making a mistake in your thought process, you want to tell the interviewer so they can help you early on. Because if you thought about it for a minute and you're wrong at the end, well, you just wasted a minute of your case interview time. And you want to try to avoid doing that as well. So that's why, like I said before, is do cases. Like, just keep on practicing them. Find a friend and just sit there and case each other. And you'll find that practice will help you a lot. Not 100%, because in the interview you don't have a friend.
Right.
But it'll still help you.
Get from a friend.
Who's your friend?
Yes,
Sometimes.
sure. Yeah, sometimes. Sometimes.
So I never worked in consulting, always investment, but I always thought consulting is such a glamorous job sometimes. Is it what don't you like about the job?
Don't you like?
Yeah, maybe let.
What may you not like?
Yeah,
about
let's-
it?
Yeah.
6 months from now.
I think, well, it sounds like you don't travel, but I think the common answer is like a lack of control over your own schedule is the big difference and the big downside of most consulting. So even if you're not traveling, client service, your client's needs come first above most everything else, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it. So that's got to be the big one, whatever form that takes. With some firms, it's almost guaranteed that you're out the door Monday through Thursday. Flying home Thursday, that just gets really old. And even if you're not doing that, it's hard to plan on, okay, I'm gonna do this thing every Wednesday night, because who knows, like, you might have a deliverable due Thursday morning that you figured you'd be done with by 6, but it's just not done, or you have revisions that you need to make. So I think no matter what firm you're at, the big thing is that you're serving a client and you don't have as much control of your schedule anymore. But you didn't ask us about the things we'd like.
Well, not like first. Get the bad stuff out of the way first, right? I mean, you're serving 2 bosses at the end of the day. You have your manager, right, who's like your main manager, and then you have your other manager who's your client. And you sometimes you don't agree with any of them, and yet you still have to do the work. And that's the really tough part about it, because you have to answer to 2 different people. And there are times when your manager tells you to do one thing and you're wrong, and then you present it to the client. Your client hates what you did because you followed your manager's decision, and you're like, I told you this is what you should have done. But at the end of the day, your client's right, but your manager's also right. So how do you which is why interpersonal relationship, having a good relationship with your manager and being able to deal with those circumstances is very important. So. And then also, I know that people like short engagements, but maybe you just don't like that, right? So that's another thing about consulting that I found. I haven't personally experienced it, but I've heard it from a lot of friends who are in consulting, is if you're on a short-term engagement, you never know where you're going to be, right? So, like Nate said, it's like you could be anywhere at any time. Even if it's a 2-month engagement, where am I gonna be the next day? I'm on the bench, like you don't have like this consistent day-to-day job. And then if you're in my case, you're sitting there with the client the whole time, and you're thinking sometimes, oh my God, how do I get out of here, right? So it's very, very tough. It's in that regard is sometimes you want it to be short and it's not. Sometimes you want it to be long and it's not. You just, like Nate said, you just don't have a lot of control over that.
And you get paid when you're on the bench.
You get paid when you're on the bench, but you're the first to be fired when you're on the bench when there's layoffs.
Yeah, what about you?
So, like Nate was saying, we don't do any travel, but I completely agree with what he was saying. The unpredictability of your schedule can get pretty tough. For example, there was a time when I was working on a case, and the case ended on Thursday. Thursday mid-afternoon, the client said, "Hey, we settled. We came to a number. We're done." We're like, "Yay, happy!" So we tell the VP, "Hey, so what do we do?" He said, "Go rest. Go do whatever you want." And then we said, "Okay, what about tomorrow?" "Just rest. Do whatever you want." So like, okay, so I go into the office, a little late, just hanging out, doing nothing, thinking that I'm gonna have a great weekend. It's I think it was Memorial Day weekend, and it's like 3 or 4 p.m. at that time, and the manager of that case messages me, "Hey Moses, what are you up to?"
Resting.
"You're rested. Do you have any plans this weekend?" So I got in a case that that's the case that I was telling you guys about, that we had to turn around by the next Friday. So it's spent, I think I left at midnight on Friday, left at like 4 a.m. on Saturday, was all day or Sunday, all day Monday, holiday weekend too. So it's typically not that bad, but the hours are, we probably average about 50-ish hours a week, which is not bad. But it's like this. So it's tough because
Sometimes it's 50 hours a weekend.
yeah, like that weekend was. So I definitely agree with what they said. You're serving a client, and the client needs something, you have to be pretty much on call. The other thing that I don't like too much about economic consulting is that even though the case is going on at the time, there's a litigation, arbitration's happening in 2 months, the analysis that I'm doing is based on something that happened in the past. So let's say an investment bank helped a security or helped a municipality issue debt in 2004, and then 2008 the market tanked, and now fast forward 2012, now they're getting sued. So now we analyze the situation 2004, 2008, the present. So you don't have the opportunity to say, this is how we project things to be, this is what you should invest in, or you're not looking at things into the future, you're looking at more, you put yourself in the past to look at things in the future, but it's not probably as exciting as it would be if you're looking at things a lifetime.
I think one other thing on the fulfillment side that might be a difference between working in a traditional, not a client, but at a company versus for a consulting firm is that you can do an awesome analysis and come up with what you think is a great recommendation, but your client doesn't always do it. And it can, I think I haven't experienced that, or I haven't experienced it enough to be frustrated by it, but I think that could get old if you feel like you're doing all this work and not seeing the world change because of what you're doing. And sometimes that's part of your job actually, though, is to get them to buy into what you're doing and to go along with it. But I've heard that voiced before from different people.
Any other questions?
I have another question. So, like when you mentioned about each project, you can have a team to complete a project. So, how about communicate with customer? You will have a one-to-one, or you will have some representative, and that person will talk to the customer.
You've had more ranging experiences.
Yeah, it depends. So one project I was on was a 2-person team, so I was talking constantly with the client. When I was an analyst, I was not allowed to talk to the client. Right, so it depends on how, it depends on your manager, the type of project you're on, and how much you know about what you're doing. So if you're an expert in computer science, I think you said, right? So if you're on a project like that and you have that knowledge, the manager might just say, hey, go ahead and talk to the client. But for someone like me, I don't know anything about computer science, so they'll say, just stay in the back, make my PowerPoint slides, do my Excels, right? So it really depends on a lot of different variables. But I would say you will interact with the client, right? Because even if you don't do it on a day-to-day basis, the client knows who you are, they'll know the team, they'll know you're there, so they'll want to talk to you. So, like, you know, in Eng's profession, he can just sit in the back, crunch spreadsheets, do his cash flows, and no one really cares about Eng, right?
That's what you wanted to say.
I didn't want to say that, but you know, no one cares. Like in the investment world, like analysts, even as a portfolio manager, sometimes like you can just sit there and not interact with the client. You can just do your research, and but in consulting, you can't do that. Like there's just so much teamwork and communication that goes on. You're going to have to interact with the client, like, again, but how much depends on a lot of different variables.
I have a question about the network between your college and your mentor or your boss inside your company.
Yeah.
Because I heard, sorry, in Accenture, they have a team review at the end of the year that you are assigned an advocate for you who try to protect you among other people, because I heard that they have a quota to cut off the bottom of the company and something like that. Do you find that process stressful for you sometimes?
Yeah, so I think that's the case in a lot of firms, though. It's not in consulting. How do you compare what you did on your project to what this other person did on their project? You're doing two different pieces of work, right? So it is very hard. So in Accenture and in a number of different other consulting firms that I know of, the review process is you have an advocate, right? We call it career counselor at Accenture, who goes into these big shouting matches. That's what it's been described as, and everyone's just saying, how do we ladder everybody, right? And there's so many things I want to say about it. So number one, yes, it is very stressful because you have absolutely no control over, because you can write a self-review, but really it's how much does your career counselor at Accenture know what you did? How much does your advocate know what you did? So you could be Nate and you could have been the one sitting in the back and you did all this great work, and that strategy that we presented in front of the client was Nate's. But if Nate's career counselor or advocate doesn't know that, and in the laddering nobody says anything about it, Nate will probably get laddered like right average, even though he should have been laddered on the very, very top. Right? So to answer, I think it was your last question, it is very stressful. However, though, in consulting you have huge networks of peers that you can always rely on. So if at any time you feel like your mentor is not doing it for you, you can always request a new one. Your manager, could also be speaking up for you, even though your advocate might not be. And it's not really, I think you said shield you from the bottom or something, right? Is that what you said? I mean, every consulting firm has their laddering process in which they'll figure out who the bottom people are. And if you're at the bottom doesn't mean you're going to get laid off. It just, most of the times when the economy is doing well, it just means you just got to step up. You have to step up what you're doing, and don't be at the bottom next time. It's not really a shield because it's just that person unfortunately has to speak up for you. So, and it's not a one-to-one relationship, right? One advocate will have 4 or 5 different people underneath them, because if I try to rank myself with the 60 other analysts and I'm being ranked, it doesn't make any sense. It's better to just have 10 people trying to argue for their peers. So it's not really, no one's shielding you from anything. It's more efficient that way.
So just to follow up on that a little bit, so do you find that you spend a fair amount of time sort of managing up in terms of your relationships with other people in your firm, or that's not a concern?
It absolutely is a concern. Like your client liking you is not enough. Your manager has to like you.